no one heard the final sound he made. There was no flash on the horizon, no plume of smoke rising above the water, no survivor's raft drifting toward the shore. There was only the routine crackle of a radio, a vector call acknowledged in a steady voice, and then an expanding silence that swallowed everything that followed. In the vast war fought across continents and oceans, silence like this was not unusual. It was the kind that left no coordinates, no wreckage, and no clear line separating duty fulfilled from life abruptly taken. It became one of the most difficult truths of the air war, that a man could lift off the ground in full command of his aircraft, climb into the cloud layers to meet a threat, and vanish so cleanly that even the sea seemed unable to remember him. This hook is not about a single dramatic moment, because the real history offers something far more unsettling. It is about the unseen spaces of the conflict, the dark water beneath the fighters' wings, the radar gaps that stretched like hidden corridors, the storm fronts that folded into themselves without warning. It is about the thousands of missions flown with discipline and courage that ended not in fire, but simply in absence. And it is about those who remained, the crews who prepared the aircraft, the controllers who repeated unanswered calls, the families who opened official telegrams that carried more questions than facts. Their memories form the only surviving trace of the flight that took off to intercept an enemy, and never returned. The history of the Second World War contains innumerable accounts of courage, loss, and quiet endurance, yet among the most haunting episodes are those involving aircraft that vanished without a trace over open water. These events, recorded in squadron diaries, official archives, and the recollections of surviving aircrew, form a distinctive category of wartime experience, sudden, irrevocable absences that left no wreckage to recover and no graves to visit. Among the hundreds of such cases, one representative mission, selected not for its uniqueness but precisely for how faithfully it mirrors the systemic reality faced by air forces on all sides, illustrates the harsh convergence of geography, technology, and circumstance that could cause a fighter to take off in full confidence and disappear forever within the span of a single sortie. This account does not center on one identifiable crewman, for that would risk attributing to the historical record what cannot be verified. Instead, it reconstructs the environment surrounding those losses and the operational frameworks within which countless individuals served, fought, and were ultimately claimed by the sea. The coastal airfields of the Allied and Axis powers alike created a specific operational landscape in which fighters routinely took to the sky to intercept enemy intruders long before radar coverage was precise enough to eliminate uncertainty. Early warning systems, though rapidly improving, were uneven in performance. Ground-based controllers monitored plots that represented extrapolated positions rather than pinpointed markers. The distances involved, particularly along the extensive coastlines of the North Sea, the English Channel, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific archipelagos, meant that interceptions frequently occurred beyond reliable visual range from any friendly vessel or aircraft. A pilot climbing to meet an enemy formation often crossed from familiar airspace into expanses of water where, if something went wrong, there would be no immediate witnesses. The infrastructure supporting these missions reflected both the urgency of wartime operations and the limitations imposed by rapid technological development. Fighter squadrons, particularly in the early and middle years of the war, operated under severe time pressure. Scramble orders could arrive with little warning, transmitted to dispersal huts where pilots remained on standby. Maintenance crews worked continuously to keep aircraft serviceable despite shortages of parts and chronic mechanical strain. Engines, whether piston-driven inline or radial types, required meticulous attention, airframes endured salt corrosion, navigation instruments could fail under vibration or moisture, and communication systems were susceptible to interference or line-of-sight obstruction. These realities were well known to ground personnel and pilots, who learned to accept them as part of daily routine. The moment of takeoff for an interception flight often occurred amid conditions of partial uncertainty. Controllers could estimate the altitude, heading, and speed of incoming aircraft, but rapid changes in trajectory or atmospheric disturbances could shift those estimates. Pilots launched with the expectation that they might have to climb aggressively upon clearing the runway, adjusting throttle and mixture to compensate for shifting airflow while maintaining visual separation in dense formations. For single-seat fighters, the challenge was greater still: navigation, radio operation, situational awareness, weapons management, and fuel monitoring all fell solely to the pilot. No supporting crew member could assist if something malfunctioned or if weather deteriorated unexpectedly. The sea represented both a geographic boundary and an operational hazard. For air forces defending or attacking targets near coastlines, the proximity of open water was unavoidable. Aircraft that encountered technical problems, combat damage, or navigational errors over land at least possessed some chance of executing forced landings. Over the sea, the margin for survival narrowed dramatically. Even with life rafts, distress signals, and coordinated search and rescue procedures, the combination of cold water, waves, fuel slicks, and poor visibility often rendered survival unlikely. Many aircraft that ditched successfully nonetheless disappeared before rescue units could locate them. For those that suffered catastrophic failure or combat damage at altitude, the descent into the water could be immediate and irreversible. On the day represented by this narrative, chosen not as a single event but as an aggregate reconstruction based firmly on documented squadron logs and operational patterns, a fighter patrol was already airborne at the time enemy activity was detected. Radar plots indicated a hostile aircraft moving toward a coastal sector critical for both military transport lanes and civilian shipping. Controllers issued an interception order to the nearest available fighter section, which included the pilot whose loss became one of many such cases recorded that year. The order was routine, following established procedures developed through years of combat experience. Pilots were expected to climb rapidly, acquire contact, assess the threat, and, if conditions permitted, engage. The environment that morning resembled countless others documented in wartime meteorological reports. Coastal airfields operated under layered cloud, with scattered cumulus formations drifting inland on moderate winds. Visibility near ground level was acceptable, though moisture buildup over the water created subtle patches of haze that were difficult to detect from the ground. These conditions were familiar and not considered hazardous in themselves. For fighters equipped with reliable instrumentation, such cloud layers were manageable, though less forgiving than clear skies. Pilots were trained to fly by reference to instruments when necessary, but uneven lighting, rapid transitions between cloud and open sky, and the constant need to scan for enemy aircraft could create disorientation even in experienced aviators. The scramble proceeded according to standard practice. Ground crews, having completed pre-flight inspections, guided the aircraft out of dispersal. The pilot conducted a brief final check of controls, fuel levels, and engine response before receiving clearance for takeoff. Nothing in the available records indicates any mechanical anomaly at this stage, nor any hesitation on the part of ground personnel. As with many missions that later ended in disappearance, the departure sequence was wholly unremarkable, a regular flight executed by a trained and capable operator. Shortly after takeoff, the fighter began its ascent toward the estimated interception altitude. Radio transmissions exchanged between the pilot and ground control were consistent with normal procedure. Controllers provided heading updates. The pilot acknowledged these instructions. There is no record of distress, confusion, or malfunction during these early exchanges. The aircraft climbed steadily, closing distance to the plotted course of the hostile intruder. Other friendly aircraft in the area reported stable flying conditions at comparable altitudes. At this stage, several factors intersected, each historically well documented and each capable, alone or in combination, of producing an irreversible loss at sea. Mechanical failure, though rare in well-maintained aircraft, remained a persistent possibility given the high operational tempo, the stresses imposed by rapid climbs, and the variability of wartime component quality. Even a minor malfunction, such as a coolant leak, fuel line rupture, or control surface issue, could escalate under combat maneuvering or at high altitude. Additionally, the reliability of magnetic compasses and other navigational instruments could be compromised by electrical interference or sudden shifts in weather, leading pilots into areas where they could not easily regain their bearings. Weather conditions, particularly over coastal waters, could change rapidly. Meteorological reports confirm frequent occurrences of low-level fog banks forming unexpectedly as warm air moved over colder water. These formations often appeared suddenly and could envelop aircraft without warning. Pilots entering such conditions risked losing visual reference to the horizon, which could induce spatial disorientation, a dangerous phenomenon in which the pilot's inner ear misrepresented the aircraft's orientation. In wartime accident investigations, disorientation was frequently cited as a contributing factor in aircraft lost over sea. Combat-related factors also played a significant role. Enemy aircraft, particularly reconnaissance or radar units, sometimes operated alone or in small numbers to exploit radar blind spots. Their armament varied, but even a brief burst from hostile guns could disable vital systems on an interceptor. The absence of surviving witnesses means that many losses attributed to operational causes may have resulted from brief, unobserved engagements. Wartime intelligence reports often documented enemy intruders turning back without confirming kills. In such cases, the fate of defending fighters remained unresolved. In the mission described here, the last recorded radio transmission from the pilot occurred shortly after receiving a vector update from ground control. The tone and content, according to the archived log, were routine. Controllers sent further instructions minutes later but received no reply. Attempts to re-establish contact were made at regular intervals, in accordance with standard procedure. When no response arrived, nearby aircraft were instructed to search the area of last known contact. The search effort was extensive. Numerous wartime accounts confirm that such operations were undertaken with determination and urgency, despite the inherent limitations. Aircraft canvassed the region along the fighter's projected flight path, flying search patterns optimized for visibility from cockpit altitude. Naval vessels in the vicinity were alerted and adjusted their patrol routes. Coastal lookout stations were instructed to report any sighting of debris, oil slicks, or parachutes. Yet nothing appeared. The sea remained visually undisturbed, offering no evidence of the aircraft's fate. The absence of debris is historically consistent with many verified wartime disappearances. A high-speed impact with water can cause an aircraft to fragment and sink within minutes. Even intact wreckage can submerge rapidly due to weight distribution. Ocean currents, varying significantly with depth and location, further complicate recovery efforts. In many cases, even when approximate crash coordinates were known, search crews failed to find tangible remains. Official documentation of the incident followed regulations in place at the time. The squadron recorded the fighter as missing after failing to return. Reports compiled by intelligence officers summarized weather conditions, last known altitude, and estimated enemy activity. None of the available documents, including squadron diaries, daily operational reports, or subsequent intelligence summaries, contained evidence sufficient to determine the exact cause of loss. This, too, aligns with established patterns. Wartime archives contain numerous entries reading simply, "failed to return" or "missing over sea," reflecting the fact that absence of information was itself a frequent and expected outcome. For the personnel remaining on the ground, the disappearance carried immediate operational and emotional consequences. Replacement procedures were routine, but the human dimension was not. Fellow pilots, who lived and worked together under constant strain, understood the abruptness with which a colleague could vanish. Their recollections, preserved in post-war memoirs and oral histories, consistently describe a mixture of resignation, sorrow, and stoic acceptance. They learned to navigate the tension between duty and grief, acknowledging loss without allowing it to interrupt operations. Mechanics, too, felt the impact. They had maintained the aircraft, spoken with the pilot before takeoff, and invested their efforts into ensuring its readiness. The broader context of the war ensured that such losses were absorbed into the vast mosaic of conflict. The pressure on air defenses remained constant. Interceptions continued daily. The disappearance of one aircraft, though deeply felt by those close to it, represented only a fraction of the total operational burden. Yet each missing pilot contributed to a cumulative absence that grew year by year. After-action reports and squadron rosters reveal the gradual attrition that affected all air forces, an attrition often most visible in the empty spaces left by those who did not return. Families received notification through official channels. Wartime communication procedures required that next of kin be informed when personnel were declared missing. These notifications were deliberately measured in tone, acknowledging uncertainty while refraining from premature conclusions. Families frequently endured long periods without definitive information, even when the likelihood of survival was minimal. Correspondence preserved in archival collections shows the emotional strain of waiting, the efforts to gather additional details, and the acceptance that eventually followed. Letters from commanding officers and chaplains, written according to established protocols, attempted to offer clarity and compassion despite the limits of available knowledge. Post-war investigations, conducted in many regions by specialized units tasked with locating missing personnel, often revisited cases like the one described. They examined operational maps, interviewed surviving aircrew, reviewed intelligence reports, and surveyed coastal areas for potential crash sites. In most instances involving disappearances far from shore, these efforts produced no further evidence. The ocean, with its depth, currents, and shifting seabed, proved a final and largely impenetrable repository for lost aircraft. The significance of these losses extends beyond the individuals involved. They embody the structural realities of Second World War air operations, the limitations of contemporary technology, and the inherent risks accepted by those who served. Pilots knew the dangers of flying over open water, particularly during rapid response missions that required immediate ascent and engagement. They understood that mechanical failure, weather changes, or enemy action could eliminate any possibility of controlled descent. They recognized that flight paths often took them beyond the range of rapid rescue. Yet they continued to take off whenever ordered, guided by collective responsibility and the broader necessity of the war effort. The historical record does not romanticize these missions. It documents them with precision, noting times, altitudes, headings, and outcomes. It records losses in terse entries and statistical summaries. But beneath these factual layers lies an undeniable human dimension recognized by veterans themselves, the knowledge that each mission demanded complete focus, that each disappearance reflected the razor-thin margin between survival and loss, and that each absence left an enduring imprint on those who remained. Veterans who recount these events emphasize not the drama of dogfights or the spectacle of aerial engagements but the quiet resolve that enabled aircrews to operate under conditions of profound uncertainty. As the war progressed, improvements in radar technology, navigation, communications, and aircraft design reduced, but did not eliminate, the frequency of unexplained losses over water. Nonetheless, even in the final years of the conflict, fighters continued to vanish during routine interceptions. Some disappeared in bad weather, some likely fell victim to enemy action, others succumbed to mechanical failure that occurred beyond the reach of observers. Their fates remain undocumented not because their efforts were forgotten but because the conditions of their service made certain kinds of evidence impossible to recover. This narrative, grounded in historically documented realities rather than the specific biography of any one individual, reflects the experiences of countless airmen whose final moments remain unrecorded. It illustrates the operational demands placed on fighter units, the environmental dangers inherent in coastal warfare, and the emotional weight borne by comrades and families. It underscores the respect owed to those who flew into uncertain skies and did not return, and to the communities that carried their absence long after the war ended. In the years that followed the disappearance described in the previous section, the war intensified in multiple theaters, and the pressure placed on fighter units grew steadily heavier. Squadrons rotated between defensive readiness and offensive sweeps, their operational tempo governed not by comfort or predictability but by the unpredictable rhythm of enemy activity. The attrition that had begun to thin rosters early in the conflict became more pronounced as each month passed. Yet the impact of these cumulative losses extended far beyond the statistical tables compiled by headquarters staff. They manifested in the subtle shifts of daily routine, the empty seat left in the mess hall, the dispersal hut cot no longer used, the aircraft bay occupied by a machine that would never again fire its engine. The case of the missing fighter, one among many, became part of the unspoken ledger that shaped how airmen understood their service. They learned that events could unfold without clarity, that outcomes could remain unresolved indefinitely, and that duty continued regardless. These truths formed a quiet foundation upon which thousands of individuals built their wartime endurance. They did not seek recognition for this endurance, they simply carried it, sometimes silently and sometimes with the measured reflections they later shared in memoirs and interviews. As operations expanded across continental fronts, coastal defenses remained essential. Fighters continued to intercept enemy aircraft probing shipping lanes, reconnaissance corridors, and industrial centers. Each intercept followed familiar procedures, yet no two missions unfolded in precisely the same manner. The variation stemmed from shifting weather, different crews, evolving tactics, and the intrinsic unpredictability of aerial combat. Even in the later stages of the war, when technological advancements improved navigational reliability and broadened radar coverage, the inherent risks of flying over water persisted. Winter storms, sudden fog banks, mechanical fatigue, and isolated enemy attacks all retained the capacity to remove aircraft from the fight with little warning. Veterans reflecting on these operations often return to a recurrent theme: the distinction between what could be known and what could never be known. Official records established timings, headings, and units. Engineering assessments outlined probable mechanical faults. Meteorological reports documented prevailing conditions. Enemy records, when available, offered insight into opposing actions. Yet for many losses, these components formed only a partial mosaic. The central event remained beyond reconstruction. Pilots climbed into their aircraft, carried out their orders, and simply did not return. The families of missing personnel confronted an especially difficult form of uncertainty. Their wartime experience did not include the traditional moments of closure associated with confirmed casualties. Instead, they navigated long periods in which official status remained missing, sometimes shifting to missing presumed deceased only after prolonged administrative review. Correspondence preserved in post-war archives captures this sense of suspended grief. Letters from relatives requested additional information. Officers replied with as much clarity as regulations allowed. Over time, the absence itself became definitive, even without physical evidence. Communities acknowledged the loss through memorial services, honor rolls, and quiet acts of remembrance undertaken by those who had known the individuals before the war. After the end of hostilities, broader efforts were made to account for missing aircrew. Specialized units from several nations conducted extensive investigations, interviewing witnesses, reviewing wartime radar logs, and surveying suspected crash zones. These units approached their work with professionalism and determination, guided by the principle that every feasible effort should be made to provide clarity to families. In many land-based crash sites, their efforts succeeded. But over water, the challenges remained extraordinary. The sea concealed aircraft beneath silt, currents displaced debris, and the passage of years erased surface evidence. The investigators documented what could be documented, acknowledged the limits of what could be found, and submitted their reports accordingly. The missing fighter from the mission described earlier remained unrecovered. Post-war inquiries recorded the loss in summary form, noting the absence of further evidence. The pilot's name, one among many listed in official memorials to the missing, was inscribed alongside others whose final resting places were similarly unknown. These memorials, created with careful attention to dignity and accuracy, serve as focal points for remembrance. They acknowledge not only the sacrifices of those who died but also the enduring absence of those whose fate could not be precisely traced. The significance of coastal air operations, and of the individual missions that sustained them, becomes clearer when examined through a post-war lens. The Second World War required enormous logistical coordination, technological innovation, and human resolve. Yet within that vast machinery, the work of intercepting enemy aircraft along coastlines was carried out by individuals whose contributions were often recorded in only a few lines of operational text. Their missions protected shipping convoys, industrial regions, and civilian populations. Their work prevented incursions that might have inflicted severe loss. They stood as the immediate line of defense, responding within minutes whenever radar screens revealed hostile movement. In assessing their role, historians have emphasized the degree to which these missions demanded readiness without certainty. Pilots scrambled with incomplete information, knowing that they might face superior numbers, adverse weather, or unknown enemy tactics. They accepted the possibility that they might not return. This acceptance did not diminish their professionalism. Instead, it defined the character of their service. Veterans repeatedly described a sense of mutual reliance. Each pilot trusted the others to carry out their duties, and each recognized that the collective effort depended on the willingness of individuals to fly despite the risks. The environment in which these missions occurred forged habits of discipline that persisted long after the war ended. Many former airmen later spoke not of the dramatic moments of combat but of the enduring practices they developed: thorough pre-flight inspections, steady attention to procedure, respect for the unpredictable nature of weather and machinery, and a deep sense of responsibility toward those who served alongside them. These habits reflected the realities of wartime aviation, where any lapse, however small, could lead to irreversible consequences. Beyond professional habits, the war shaped broader attitudes toward loss and remembrance. Those who survived understood that their service had been defined as much by absence as by action. They carried memories of friends who did not return, of missions that ended abruptly, and of names added to official lists that grew steadily throughout the war. Their recollections, shared in interviews and memoirs, demonstrate a quiet resolve. They did not embellish events, nor did they seek to elevate their own roles. Instead, they spoke with clarity about what the war demanded and about the lives that remained unfinished because of it. The missing fighter, though only one example among many, represents a wider truth. Thousands of airmen served in similar circumstances, accepting the uncertainties of flying over open water without hesitation. Their efforts contributed directly to the outcome of the conflict, even when their final moments left no trace. To acknowledge this is not to impose narrative closure where none exists but to recognize the integrity of their service. They fulfilled their duty to the fullest extent permitted by circumstance, often with little expectation of recognition. The historical landscape surrounding these losses also reveals the profound interdependence of wartime roles. Pilots depended on ground controllers for accurate vectors, controllers relied on radar operators for timely detection, mechanics ensured that aircraft remained airworthy despite shortages and wear, meteorologists provided forecasts that guided mission planning, naval units conducted search and rescue operations whenever conditions allowed. Each component of this system contributed to the overall defense effort, and each reflected the collective commitment required to sustain prolonged conflict. As decades passed, the memory of wartime aviation evolved. Museums, archives, and educational institutions documented the experience of airmen through preserved aircraft, recorded testimonies, and carefully curated exhibits. These efforts aimed not only to preserve history but also to convey the human dimension of the conflict. They highlighted the conditions under which airmen served, the technologies they operated, and the risks they accepted. In doing so, they provided context for future generations, enabling them to understand the scale of sacrifice and the integrity with which individuals approached their duties. Among these efforts, particular attention has been given to the memorials dedicated to those who have no known grave. These structures, often situated near former airfields or along coastlines that once buzzed with wartime activity, offer a place for reflection. Their inscriptions, arranged by name rather than by rank, underscore the equality of sacrifice. They remind visitors that the war's outcomes were shaped by individuals whose service cannot be fully reconstructed but whose absence is indelibly recorded in the historical record. The significance of these memorials is not solely historical, it is also generational. Families who lost relatives without receiving definitive information have visited these sites to pay their respects, sometimes decades after the war ended. Veterans have attended ceremonies honoring their missing comrades, standing in silent recognition of lives cut short. These gatherings reflect a shared understanding. Even when the details of a final mission remain unknown, the value of service remains clear. From an analytical standpoint, the disappearance of aircraft over water illustrates broader themes in military history. It highlights the intersection of human effort and environmental constraint, the limits of technology in an era of rapid innovation, and the ways in which uncertainty shapes operational outcomes. It also demonstrates the importance of documenting events as fully as possible, even when documentation cannot capture the entirety of what occurred. Historians studying these patterns emphasize not the tragedy inherent in each loss but the responsibility to preserve accurate and respectful accounts. As this narrative draws toward its conclusion, it becomes essential to acknowledge what can be said with certainty about the missing fighter and others like it. They took off into conditions typical of wartime operations. They carried out their orders with professionalism and resolve. They encountered hazards, whether mechanical, environmental, or combat-related, that were inherent to their duties. When they did not return, their loss was recorded with the precision allowed by available information. Their absence imposed quiet but lasting consequences on families, comrades, and communities. And yet, despite this absence, their service endures in the structure of post-war memory. They are remembered not because their final moments are known but because their willingness to accept uncertainty was itself an act of profound commitment. Their disappearance does not diminish their contribution, rather, it underscores the demands placed upon all who served in the air during the Second World War. The war eventually ended. The coastal airfields gradually returned to peacetime roles, their dispersal huts dismantled, their runways quieted. Radar stations were decommissioned or adapted for new purposes. Naval vessels resumed non-combat duties. The men and women who had staffed these facilities transitioned back into civilian life, carrying with them memories of years defined by urgency and loss. Yet the sea remained, unchanged in its capacity to conceal what fell into its depths. It held the stories of aircraft that vanished, not as a deliberate act but as a natural consequence of geography and circumstance. And while the sea did not return its secrets, those who lived through the war found meaning in acknowledging what it represented. They understood that the ocean, vast and indifferent, formed both a boundary and a witness to the events that had shaped their lives. In reflecting on the fate of the missing fighter, one can find neither resolution nor finality. Instead, one finds continuity, the continuity of remembrance, of historical documentation, and of the values embodied by those who served. The story does not conclude with discovery or recovery but with acknowledgement. It ends where so many wartime stories end, with a name inscribed on a memorial, with records preserved in archives, and with the understanding that absence is itself part of the historical truth. This, ultimately, is the ending such an account can rightfully have. Not an ending of spectacle or dramatization, but one that honors the real pattern of events faced by real airmen. It is an ending defined by respect for what they endured, for the uncertainties they accepted, and for the enduring legacy they left behind. It is an ending shaped by the recognition that the most profound acts of courage often occur quietly, in the spaces where certainty cannot reach. The fighter that rose to intercept an enemy aircraft and vanished forever above the sea remains emblematic of this truth. It represents not a mystery to be solved but a service to be acknowledged. Its fate is inseparable from the fate of countless others whose stories align in structure even when details differ. Together, they form a collective narrative, one grounded not in speculation but in documented experience, one that stands as a testament to the resolve, duty, and sacrifice of all who flew into danger and did not return. And so the story ends not with revelation, but with recognition. Recognition that some wartime paths remain unfinished, that some flights end in silence rather than certainty, and that some sacrifices lie forever beyond recovery. Recognition that the value of service is not diminished by the absence of details. Recognition that the memory of those who disappeared endures precisely because they faced the unknown with unwavering commitment. This is the ending history allows. It is measured, honest, and respectful. And in its quiet truth, it carries its own form of enduring strength.